Hey everybody, I'm Anne and welcome back to Painting Big, where today we're going to tackle for our $2 video for the month of November, doing dings and scratches on a sword blade. Okay, let's get to it. All right, with no delay here today on our knoll, which if you've been watching Reaper Pro Tips, you are familiar with our knoll pirate friend. I thought that I would use his blades since we're going to be probably painting over it on the stream. So the first thing to think about is you want to kind of figure out where your dents and dings are going to be. And you usually want to kind of put in the dark first, in my experience. So on this blade, there actually are a couple of little divots kind of in the sculpt toward the bottom. And there's kind of a bit of a dash up here, and I could probably put another scratch in here. So first off, we're going to be using some brown liner. I'm actually using a wet palette today, but you can also just use brown liner, thinned about 5:1. You want to get, you want it to be dark still so that you can see the scratches, but you don't want it to be super, super dark where it's just a blob. So for the scratch, let's put a bit of a scratch across the blade here. Like he's used the back of the blade to block something, right? So we'll do the nick. We'll do it in dark. And what that is just a shadow. There we go, a little bit more. Now, this is part of a series that I'm going to be doing on how much texture can you really do on a 28mm model. And the answer is not as much as you can do on a bust, but a surprising amount nonetheless. So let's just fill in some of these little like divots down here and maybe even do one kind of up here as if he's got a little bit of a dent there. So dents are spots or splotches, and cuts or cracks or slashes or dings or scratches are lines. Let's do a little bit of a line there. All right, so let's really, really nick up his blade here. That sounds great. Okay, so we've got two different little scratches there, and then we've got a couple of dings. We've got a tiny little one, a bigger one down toward the bottom, and then a big one up top. So for these little tiny ones, you don't really need to make an effort to blend them in or anything, but you do when you go to do your highlights, you want to do just a highlight really at the bottom. So let's go in, and I've got my pure white here, and I'm thinning it on the wet palette, but usually I would thin it about 2:1, maybe like 5 drops to 2 drops of paint to water. Whatever you can get. You want to lighten up really the bottom edge of that little ding. And I actually got a little bit overwhelming with my white there. There we go. The quick erase button. Always know where your erase button is. So that was maybe a little bit thick with that white. Let me get it and make sure my brush is really well pointed and really unloaded. You want your brush to come to a really fine tip so you can do these. Let's do the one above it while I wait for that to dry. So just a little tiny touch of white along the bottom of that little divot. See how that makes it look like it's just like a divot in the blade? Like maybe it's even some pitting. Like maybe the blade has gotten old and corroded. I was thinking about doing a rust effect on the front. And then we can do this one. And the reason we're doing it on the bottom is that when there's an indentation in a surface, the light is usually, it's going to not hit that indent, right? That indent's going to be in shadow, and that's that blotch that you put down. But that bottom edge, when it comes back up, it's going to catch the light. So adding that makes it look like it's three-dimensional. If you want, if you get a little rough, you can add in a little bit more of your gray. In this case, it's cloudy gray, 9089. That's been mixed with just a little bit of brown liner to give it a little bit of different color. So that's starting to look really three-dimensional. Now with the slashes, you do exactly the same thing. Reach for your thinned white. Make sure that when you load up your brush, you unload it enough so that it comes to a really fine point so that you don't have a lot of fluid on it because you need control. And you can use pretty thinned white for this because white covers so well. So it'll stand up to thinning. Here's the challenging part. You got to get that bottom edge of that. And if the paint's not coming off, that means it's not thin enough. Either get a little bit more water in your brush to keep your paint wet, or go back and reload your brush. Reloading is probably better if you're not used to the trick that I do. which is to keep more fluid in the body of my brush. So there we go. And don't feel, if you have to go back and forth to touch these up, that's just fine. As you can see, dings and scratches are really easy. Like, they really are on metal. They're a lot simpler than you thought. The biggest challenge to these is to get your brush strokes fine enough, right? Because the key to doing texture on these little guys is that you need to have the brush control to do really fine little tiny patterns. Now let's go ahead and get the bottom one that we screwed up the first time. There we go. So we've got that. So we've got a number of dings and scratches. Now, when you've got bigger ones, you probably do want to blend them in a little bit at the top, as if it's kind of a slight indentation. But unless it's like a puncture, it's not going to have too hard edges, right? It's going to kind of be an indent that goes kind of like a V, right? So putting a little bit of highlight at the top to blend in that upper edge can create a better, can create a more realistic effect. Also, the darker you make your divots and your scratches, the deeper they're going to appear to be. So if you don't want a very deep scratch, if you're looking for more of a shallow divot, then think about putting some gray over the top of your dark to make it a little less so. That will make it look a lot more shallow. Whereas if you do a really dark one like these scratches, they look like they're pretty deep right now. Because I went pretty dark. So what you can do is, if you're seeing that that's coming across too dark, you can paint some gray over them. Or when you start, you can just use a lighter gray. So that works really good. Alrighty. Let's do just a little bit of additional patterning. So if we've got if it's actually pitting, like say the blade is kind of rotting, you probably want to put some rust effects in here too, but you'd probably want to do a little bit of a speckled surface to suggest the metal is actually like starting to wear away, to get some pits and things. Let me get a little bit more water on here. We want to stipple. This is why people like use their thumbs all the time when they're painting, when they're working with a wet palette. Make sure you've got a good tip on your brush that's coming to a good point. And then add in some little tiny kind of stipples. And you can put them kind of near your near the areas where you felt like maybe the metal is kind of like going to pot, right? Kind of looks like it's fragmenting, kind of looks like maybe it's about to completely lose, maybe that sword's going to break on the next swing, that sort of thing. So you can totally do that by putting in those tiny little speckles. And if you want, you can then suggest, again, just the same thing we did with the first part, which is just just a little bit of speckle, like white speckle right under some of the bigger ones of those, if you can get it. Like I said, a little bit of patience, good brush control, thin paint, fine tip. And you don't have to. You can just do the darks if you want to kind of suggest like that they're really shallow. But if you put a little bit of that white underneath there, it does suggest that the blade is really rotting, really going to pot. So you can suggest some of that compromisation of a weapon that's really not very well cared for. And again, if you feel like you've gotten too dark with your dots, you can always bring the gray back over to really mess it up. So that's what we look like. That's an easy guide to doing dings and scratches. And this is the same here as if you do it on a breastplate. And it's the same if you do it with metallics or with regular paint, because look at what we've done on Mr. Grumpy here. What did I do? Here he's got a couple of dents. We've got the dashes, we've got scratches, we've got a dent right there with the lower edge highlighted. Same over here. Remember, see the fade? We got a dark, like a sword blade has impacted this, but then it kind of fades up. So it's like it's a hard punch and just that upper edge, that lower edge is catching the light. And so you do the same thing no matter what the metal material is. And no matter what the scale, it's just that, like with Mr. Grumpy, we have all this room to do all these fine effects and really layer our textures in. Whereas on a small model, we need to keep it simpler. All right? Okay, thus ends texture video. What texture can you really do on a 28 millimeter? That ends texture video number 1. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Stay tuned for next month. I'm going to come up with a different texture that we can show to do real simple and real quick. Okay? Thanks, everybody. This is Anne signing off.